So Rhonda Myozan, who, Rhonda, I think the last time you were teaching around the elections, and I was just kind of blown away by how many different hats you wear and how many things you do. So this is only going to capture a bit of it. But Rhonda is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco, and this thought leader of mindfulness and how mindfulness sits at the intersection or can infuse higher education, law, social change work. She's written very widely on this topic and been published kind of across the spectrum on where the intersection of those issues are, including the intersections of mindfulness and race and gender, law, medicine, education. And she also serves on a ton of committees and boards in the educational environment in the world of law, as well as being a recent fellow at the Mind and Life Institute, and playing a role in that world of bringing mindfulness into academic research and academic thought and conversation. So Rhonda, it's wonderful to have you here tonight. And Sensei Kritee Kanko is a climate scientist, an educator, an activist, and a grief ritual leader. And also, of course, a Zen priest. She's a sensei in the Rinzai Zen lineage and Cold Mountain lineage, and a founding Dharma teacher of Boundless in Motion, as well as a co-founder of Rocky Mountain Eco Dharma Retreat. So she's a Zen teacher and widely writes on the issue of Zen and contemporary activism, and many of the same issues that Rhonda does. You've probably read her work in Tricycle and Lion's Roar and Buddha Dharma. And at the same time, she's a senior scientist at the Global Climate Program, or rather in the Global Climate Program, which is a program within the Environmental Defense Fund, where she has implemented some farming techniques and science to scale in India and elsewhere. So it's a joy to have you both here. And I don't know who's starting, to be frank, but whoever is, take it away. Wonderful to see you both.
Good evening, and thank you for that beautiful and kind introduction. And I'd like to just say out front that I really feel honored to be here with you all tonight, to have this opportunity to share some reflections on a topic that's kind of timely around deconstructing race, liberating, let's say, the racist mind that might be in any one of us. So I will, just to give a little bit of a sense of how we will move through tonight's reflections. Sensei has generously invited me to really just to offer reflections at the outset here, and then turn it over to her for her to share some reflections as well, perhaps give us a little bit of a teaser or a segue into an event we'll be doing together this weekend to continue these reflections in a really robust day-long engagement, about which we'll say more a bit later. So for my part, as you all know, this effort to create a deeper understanding of what's at stake when we look at race and racism in our world is really featured prominently in my work. And I should say, although Matthew described a number of different engagements that I've been in, at the moment, I'm in a process of creating a bit more space, having let go of certain of my prior roles in the world, allowed my tenures here and there in leadership roles here and there to kind of be released to enable a period of more spacious exploration, practice, time in meditation and reflection and in writing. So I'm really grateful to have this time with you as a bit of a point of that pivot for me, finishing my work at the University of San Francisco, taking a leave of absence next year. And so the comments and remarks that I'm going to share are again, picking up on some of the kinds of reflections I've offered in different places. A book on Buddhism and whiteness has a chapter that I'm going to be drawing on, chapter that I wrote that I'm going to be drawing on here. The chapter was called Making and Taking Refuge in racial and whiteness awareness, right? So it was really about these themes as well, offered again as part of a compilation to help us really look at whiteness as an aspect of Buddhism. And of course, the book that I wrote a couple of years ago, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness, is another place where I had sought to set forth in a more sustained way some of what I had observed along the path of being a university professor in this time, teaching classes dealing with racism and American legal history for 20 years in San Francisco, where I'm privileged to be sitting right now, a place where many different cultures come together and have since the founding here in California on land that, of course, was not ceded, but was taken by a variety of very diverse number of indigenous, Native American, Indian tribes. And so the spirit of coming together from different perspectives, humbly offering reflections drawn from my experience, my lived experience in this body, and the particular experience I've had as a professor, but also as a student. I consider myself certainly a lifelong student of our dear Roshi Joan, of Norman Fisher, from a former abbot of the San Francisco Zen Center. And currently one of the collaborations and one of my teachers at the moment is Bhikkhu Analio, a scholar of early Buddhism, with whom I've actually been in conversation about some of the themes that I'm going to really explore with you here. He and I are playing around in the field of seeing what kinds of collaborations might come from our two very distinct paths to this point, in some teachings and some perhaps writings going forward. So the topic that we put forth tonight is Deconstructing Race, Liberating the Racist Mind, Practice-Based Insights from Contemplating the Elements, actually. So while there's so many different ways we might, and we all have been, I think, exploring in the recent era, what our experience in the world has taught us about some of the ways that race and racism show up as painful examples of what we might call suffering, we might call distress, attachment, confusion, ignorance, aversion, right? There are many ways that we can just sort of look at what we are learning, what we are seeing in the world around race and racism, and explore how our deep teachings and practices, how the teachings of the Buddha that we've been privileged to explore and to be students of, to be learning and to be sharing, how it is that they help us understand a little bit more about the harm that racism does and our way in that, our experience of that, what we know about it, that we often haven't been given a lot of space and support for unpacking and sharing with each other and consciously disrupting. And so a lot of what I've been seeking to do is, in my first drawing on my own experience, really, becoming more present to how race and racism have shown up in my own experience, do show up in my own experience, are part of what can cause suffering for me, right? Part of what I can find myself feeling emotionally reactive to, right? Things that I might experience myself personally in interactions with others, or reactions I have when I'm faced with the news or something coming up, some new revelation. Just this last few weeks, we've been, as a culture, exposed to new histories around Tulsa Race Massacre, right, of 1921. So the 100th anniversary of that coming right just before the first commemoration of Juneteenth, right, which a new holiday in the United States. It's hard to think of it as a day of celebration, really, unambiguously, because although it's meant to commemorate the time at which, the date at which the last group of enslaved human beings in Galveston, Texas, learned about the emancipation and the ending of the Civil War and the freedom, the Jubilee, as it was called, the hope for Jubilee, and then Jubilee. This was the name that the enslaved African Americans, Black folk, gave to what would come after slavery. And so Juneteenth has been this point, this inflection point in our culture for us to be learning a little bit more about history we often didn't know, like the Tulsa Race Massacre. But also in the current last week, last couple of weeks, many of us have been learning a little bit more about painful Indigenous histories, right? The histories of the boarding schools, somewhat euphemistically named an institution in Canada and in the United States for really the forced assimilation, the deculturalization, the, in some ways, sustained cultural dominance and terrorism of Indigenous people in the United States and in Canada, First Nations peoples. That, again, when we think of as boarding schools, we sort of think, well, maybe it was a pleasant place people went to learn, but we now know, and if we're willing to see it, we can see that they were much more than that, and they were really places of deep harm. And so our culture is built on all of this. We know some of this history. We are called upon, and I think in this time, to more courageously turn toward rather than away from what there is to know about the history that shaped our current circumstances. But also, we're called upon to sit with each other with more courage and more, let's call it stamina or capacity to be with some of these painful legacies, to be with the experiences that we have around race and racism, and to, I hope, together create some liberating way of being that can only come from turning toward and going through together. We've seen what turning away from and going around together has netted us as a society. I think that in no small measure, part of what we're dealing with on the macro level, these interlocking pandemics of coronavirus, reckoning with racisms and schisms and all of these social identity-based oppressions as they intersect and show up in our communities in differential rates of suffering and distress, right? The pandemic, if you will, around climate distress. All of these things are huge macro problems that are intersecting and demanding that we figure out another way to be together. One that I think minimizes and disrupts as much as possible these habits and patterns we have around creating a sense of self, defined by profound notions of us versus them, and then developing policies and laws and institutions and economic structures that travel with the notion of some lives are more valuable than others, that enable some parts of our communities to be more protected from pollution, from the waste products of our lifestyle and the harmful effects of our lifestyle. So when I talk about race and racism, I think that, like the practices we've inherited from our Buddhist teachers themselves, we're invited to think about these concepts, right, with the scaffolding of the core teachings, the Four Noble Truths. That, yes, there is, whether we call it suffering, dissatisfaction, distress, related to the clinging to conditioned realities, right? Clinging to the idea that there is a separate self, clinging to the idea that there are separate selves that are more valuable because they come from certain cultures versus others, or they come from certain backgrounds versus others, or they've studied at certain places and or they haven't. Whatever these, right, these notions, if we look to the Four Noble Truths and we look to the practices that we have inherited to help disrupt the suffering, to disrupt the pain of clinging, of avoidance, of ignorance, right? There is that dissatisfaction, that dukkha. There are causes of it, the root poisons. What are the causes of the dukkha of racial suffering, you might say? What is that? What does it look like where you are right now? And how do we know? How can we taste? How can we really, through our practices, disrupt some of that suffering, some of that dissatisfaction in the unskillful ways we relate to it, including pushing away information about it? Haven't we heard it enough? Haven't we done all the reckoning? Haven't we had enough, teachings around diversity and racism? Some of us might be feeling a little bit of that. Or maybe it's just overwhelm, right? What are the different ways that we react to this latest piece of information? Oh, now we are being called to look again at the harms of our history of genocidal practices against Indigenous people. How do we react? How are we tempted to react when invited into conversations and engagements that seek to repair, right? Seek to invite us into considering how to act with wisdom in response to what we now know. So there is suffering, there are root causes of it. There is a path to liberation, right? To disrupting the suffering. Tradition calls that path the Eightfold Path. And within that, mindfulness, right mindfulness, right awareness, It's just one element, one aspect, right, of an entire kind of ethically grounded path that we know to be the, let's say, the prescription for liberating and healing these aspects of our experience that lead to distress and suffering, including the aspects that are around race and racism. And so I just want to share that one of the aspects of all of this that I've been diving into a little bit more with the support of my friend and teacher, Analio, looking at, some of the early teachings, the early Buddhist teachings on the establishments of mindfulness, including mindfulness of the body, right? And really allowing a deeper dive on looking at how it is that, first of all, we can see some of the attachments to ideas and notions we have about the body as being really at the root of race and racism, right? Attachment to certain bodies, our own body as having a certain kind of value and a certain kind of something that if we are willing to look, we can see that some of the ways we hold our own bodies, our own racial identities and the identities of others based on race has some content that we've imbibed because we live and have been trained in racist systems and cultures. Some content around, how I am relative to others and how people like me, what they deserve and where they belong and where others don't. So othering and belonging patterns, of course, we've all imbibed these. And so certainly attachment to notions of this body being somehow precious and valuable, and maybe more precious because I have lighter skin, let's say. There's something called colorism that runs amongst people of color that is, touches and concerns white supremacy. It's sort of a kind of an analog to it that's embedded within communities of color often, and it shows up differently in different places. So the real inquiry is always, how is it showing up for each of us? And if we are of color, how is some internalized racism, internalized notions of colorism and hierarchies of value, all of us in some way have been touched by this. And so how do we first unpack some of the ways we are going around deluded, somehow kind of unaware of our own embeddedness and attachment, some subtle ways we might be clinging to a sense of self that's somehow puffed up, somehow got a little bit of conceit that has to do with some notion of our embodiment as being a little bit better, a little bit more beautiful, a little bit more normal. So inviting, really looking at how we form a sense of self and how we might disrupt that. And this is where reflection on the elements might come in. And by the way, for me, mindfulness, if I'm really, in my own experience, there's always some potential for joy in the practice. Even in the practice that's about exploring race and racism more carefully. There's got to be some access to a kind of deeper knowing that kind of disrupts some of the conventional wisdoms. And certainly, and I've written about it in different places, some of the ways that, for example, the right view of who we really are beyond all of these notions of cisgender, Black-bodied, female, born in Southern segregated United States. Yes, that is a kind of a part of who I am, right? I do have this identity in the world, but is that who I am really fully? So in my practice these days, practicing on awareness of the body and mindfulness of the body and reflecting on the elements, right? Water, fire, earth, and wind. and really practicing body scans and practicing in ways that remind me that fundamentally, I, just like you, am made up of these elements that are, are the constituent parts of everything that lives on the planet. So whenever I'm tempted to get stuck, and we know that one of the early teachings of the Buddha about how we navigate the floods, and the floods are the samsara, the confusion of our time. We navigate it by not straining and not getting stuck, right? The middle way. And for me, that middle way is a kind of a, yes, studying some history, learning about this painful new history or new example of something I need to know about racism in the world, but not getting stuck, opening up and seeing, here too are the elements. I'm going to read this poem from my book, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kritee for her reflections here. She had agreed to let me spend a little bit more time. For those of you who are wondering, is this fair? We had this agreement. So I'm going to just read this poem. If the path could speak, beneath these words rests the awareness of generations and of generations and of the generations that have come before. The awareness that each one of us is a vital part of the earth that we call home, is of the rain, the wind, the fire, the air, and so inherently belongs. If the path could speak, it would say, we must assert that which already exists deep within us, namely a sense of kinship with all those with whom we share the earth. On repeat, in every language, unceasingly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. That was beautiful. I personally wished you would go on. I have heard myself speak many times over. I am going to just speak about, Rhonda was highlighting how in the Eightfold Path, right? So there's racial suffering, how when we take the lens of Four Noble Truths, within that there is eightfold path, and then there is mindfulness, and how mindfulness can help us deconstruct our racial mind, right? Racist mind, racial mind. And I'm going to speak about the same thing, maybe use slightly different terminology that I have come to love, which is speaking in terms of these things in terms of trauma, right? So the racist mind, or the mind of the oppressed, the way I like to speak about these days is the mind of fight, flight, or freeze, right? The oppressed mind, I'm generalizing it for now, let's say goes into freeze. I don't know if I belong. I don't know if I should speak up. Is my voice welcome? And so I am going to suppress my voice, right? I have done that as a woman. I have done that as a person of color in primarily white spaces. And then the aggressive mind can be in the fight or flight mode, where I got it. I got to speak up. I have to fight it out. I rule, right? The messaging. And as a climate scientist, right, I'm not necessarily wearing my Dharma hat right now, as much as I'm connecting what Rhonda has talked about with the event we're going to have on 10th of July. As a climate scientist, I used to just get so frustrated, angry that all the facts are with us. Why aren't we able to act? And the place I came to was that our minds are so traumatized, so much in fight, flight, and freeze, that if I gave you another statistic about what's happening to our climate, the drought, my husband studies drought, and he's been telling me last few weeks, Kritee, record drought. He tears up talking about drought. But if I use the next 5 minutes telling you statistics about what's happening, all these layers of trauma that we carry from our family, from our fathers being alcoholic, from our mothers not being available, from domestic violence, from alcoholic relatives, sexual abuse. 1 in 5 people in United States, 1 in 5 kids were sexually molested in United States, right? On all of these layers of trauma that have put us in fight, flight, or freeze, news about climate is another trauma in our system, correct? And so I have softened so much. I have not stopped worrying about climate or social justice, but it has softened my heart to know why we are not acting, because I was in this mode of me getting in just agitated mind, not accepting why we are not able to act creatively and courageously. So in addition to mindfulness practices that our Buddhist teachers have left us with, Buddha has left us with, one thing that I come back to powerfully, and Roshi Joan has talked about it in many contexts, is the need to grieve. And I'm sure all of you have read and worked with teachings of Joanna Macy. I just think that we need to lift up that work of needing to express our despair, right? The truth, our pain for the world, our pain for the world, our pain for what has happened to us, our race, our culture. So crucial. Cannot emphasize that enough. And I have also become a huge fan of doing that work in small groups. There is a power in doing grief work in large communities where there are sometimes 50 people, 100 people, 30 people, and doing these powerful rituals of expressing layers of these trauma that I just talked about. And I think that should not substitute the work of sharing our burdens, kind of unloading what we are going through in presence of loving friends. I call that magic number 5 to 8. If we really want to be creative, if we really want to go powerfully forward, just like we need Sangha to do retreats, sessions, zazenkais, just like to jog, we need it's always more joyous and powerful when we do it with others. Doing vulnerable work of tapping into our grief, expressing it, and composting our grief requires a loving container and consistent container, ongoing container. I'm going to be accountable to you when I am suppressing my grief, right? I'll end with a little story. Some of you might know that my beloved land, India, went through enormous crisis in late April, May, June, right? Those 6 weeks were the hardest 6 weeks of my life because every day I learned of a beloved family, friend, colleague dying. I was staying up multiple nights in a week, begging for oxygen from far away, right? Telling people in other parts of India, can you please arrange some steroids, some oxygen concentrators? The COVID wave, devastated my people. I lost a 32-year-old nephew. I lost a beloved uncle who was like my father after my father had passed away when I was a little girl. I could just go on and on. You know what helped me out? And I was in freeze. I was either fighting for oxygen or I was in freeze. I was not functional. I was not doing my climate scientist job. You know what got me out of it? You would imagine as a Zen teacher, I would say meditation. That wasn't it, friends. That wasn't it. What got me out was grief work I did with my own Sangha. Sometimes people say, you know, teachers shouldn't be vulnerable in front of their students. Students shouldn't need to hold the grief of their teachers. But the situation was so dire after being away from our Sangha gatherings for 2-3 weeks. I thought I couldn't run away from it anymore. We had a gathering, I broke down. And when the intensity of the COVID wave in India lessened, our Sangha organized a grief circle and we invited everyone who cared about India. And we did it consistently again and again. That's what reset my nervous system out of fight, flight, and freeze. So I'm gonna end by saying that, and we will explore this more deeply on 10th of July. I hope many of you can join us. All of this drive that we feel to work for peace and justice in the political realm, right? Not just in our personal lives. For that to happen, I feel very clear that we have to do our own grief work, vulnerability work, be authentic in our relationships. This working authentically on these problems, courageously in these problems, which are not going to go away. With every passing year, the climate crisis is going to deepen and we're going to see catastrophe after catastrophe. It might not be pandemic, but it will be fires and droughts and floods. That creative, courageous work will not happen unless we have unloaded our nervous systems by doing belonging, right? We're doing belonging. And to belong, we have to be authentic and vulnerable. And my suggestion is to find your tribe, a group of people with whom you can do that authentic grief work, anger work, right? So that's all I have for now. Let's settle down with these ideas and just end with some silence, but I will guide us into it if you would allow me. So inviting all of us, I know I spoke at some speed here maybe and threw in several things at you, all the way from what happened in India. Maybe as you think about India, you can imagine your care going out to my people. As you breathe deeply, bring your awareness to your hara, your abdomen. Maybe there are thoughts and emotions and sensations that have gotten unlocked from what Rhonda and I shared. Those images, not suppressing them, but just asking them to stay on the side, and coming back to the ground of our being. to the rise and fall of our breath. If nothing else, I find that we can focus on the sound of our out breath. Let's just rest in the sound of our out breath the next couple of minutes, then we'll ring the bell and have questions.
Kritee. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhonda. We're going to conclude the kind of formal Dharma talk. And those of you who are joining us on YouTube, thank you for being here. Good to see you here this week. We'll see you next week. Norman Fisher will be joining us next week in the evening. And later that week, I think on Saturday, we'll be leading a day-long teaching on his new book, When You Greet Me, I Bow. So I hope you'll join us next week as well. And wonderful to see everyone.
And also on Saturday, Kritee and Heather McTeer-Tony, Deki Lachun Alpa, Rhonda will all be together. Really prophetic voices, women's voices, exploring this intersection between race and social and environmental justice. So thank you, YouTube friends. And now let's open with Kozan moderating. Any questions or insights that you want to bring to Rhonda and Kritee?
So as usual, just raise your digital hand, and particularly those who haven't had a chance to speak in our recent meetings. Really invite you to share how this has hit you today, what's arisen for you, and any questions you might have. This invitation for us to meet where we are right now in the world in all its complexity and the often simplicity of our grief as well. So as Rhonda says, questions, reflections, all are welcome. Whatever are on people's mind. Heidi, go ahead.
Hi, and thank you for your beautiful educational and loving talks. I just wanted to, I don't necessarily have a comment myself, but I wanted to draw attention and maybe ask for reflection on, sorry, but an editorial in the New York Times by Ross Dutat, July 3rd, on the excesses of anti-racist education. It's the title of the editorial opinion, excesses of anti-racist education. And it drew my attention because it's saying it's all, this is what we want is acknowledgement that, more than 50% of Republicans even acknowledge that there's been structural racism. So we just need acknowledgement, but what we don't want is moral education on this and education about whiteness. And because that's going down a, so it's July 3rd, and I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Douthat, the author. But it's really relevant to what we've been trying to get at here, I think. And it's trying to tamp down moving forward, it seems. So that's all. I just want to offer that to our note.
Thank you, Heidi. Whoever, either one of you want to take that on, or maybe both. It's an important question. It's a hot debate right now.
Yeah. Well, it is a hot question and topic right now. I haven't had a chance to see Ross's essay from the 3rd. I'll look for it. Thank you, Heidi. I'll look for that date in that essay. But in general, we are meeting at a time where there's a lot of reactivity in the world around the efforts to create spaces, small spaces, medium-sized spaces, pedagogical opportunities in classrooms where we could learn and teach and share and ask good questions about race and racism in our time. So having not read that particular analysis, you know, I think it's very interesting to just note that, you know, everybody has a perspective on this. And I think one of the things that the current effort is trying to do is invite the voices that have not been heard into these conversations, the identities that have been traditionally marginalized into the conversations to hear. In fact, you know, I'm a law professor, so I happen to know that what actually started as critical race theory, which is different from what we're hearing is critical race theory. In the law schools, it really was about examining law and policy and examining its impact in terms of reinstating racial hierarchy and seeing the persistence of the struggle, the reinstitutionalization, like the kind of what race retrenchment, like we see some newness, some opportunity, some freedom, right? You look at the ending of slavery with the Civil War, the Reconstruction period, brief period of like, wow, multiracial democracy is actually happening. And then shutting that down, Supreme Court suddenly saying that the 14th Amendment actually doesn't stand for equality. In fact, separate but equal is what it means. And so segregation. So that history of opportunity shutdown is what critical race theory was meant to just name if we're talking about acknowledging things. And all the other things, what is whiteness, et cetera, that's not necessarily germane to critical race theory, but it's something that scholars are interested in. And so the question is, are we curious? And can we be curious about race and racism? And that's really a question for all of us. And we are going to have our own answers, but I hope that we see that if we're curious about what it means to be alive, we might be curious about that aspect of it too.
Well said, Rhonda. If you're curious about life, if you're curious about reality, how can you not look at that piece? I'm going to take, we hear the word interbeing, interconnectedness, always talk about it. If I am one body and there is one part of me which has been enslaved, hurt, brutalized, raped for 200 years or 500 years, and the other part hasn't seen that brutalization, I will never be whole and healed. I want the part which hasn't seen that trauma and hurt to see that part. So for me, the conversation around race is about seeing each other's trauma. Now, if that conversation, I haven't read that piece either, so I'm going to look it up. I'm not responding to that piece. I'm just talking about the need to talk about race. I don't necessarily agree with language and phrasing the way it's done in popular media and so on, but my heartfelt desire is that we do need to see each other's traumatized part, right? And how we do it matters. If we are going to do race conversations in a way which is always going to blame and shame white folks, that puts them back in fight and flight. We don't create healing that way. We need to hear the truth, but hear the truth in a way that heals all of us, the one body, the interbeing. But if we do it in a way that you were oppressor first, I was oppressed first, now I am going to become oppressor and you always have to hear what I got to say regardless of what's going on in your body, that might not work out, right? So trauma-informed conversation, and it's very hard, it gets messy, but I don't think we have the option of running away from it. We cannot become the power we need to be to face climate crisis or any other crisis if we are not going to come together shoulder to shoulder with people of all races. I'm totally clear about that.
Thank you both. Monica.
Thank you. Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you, Sensei Kanko. Just really wanted to say out loud my thank you to both of you as women of color who are talking about this topic. So many things are coming to my mind. I recently spent a week up in the Catskills in New York. I live in New York City. And one, I was born and raised in New York and noticed immediately just how weird it was to be in silence, and the hypervigilance I felt about caring for my body. And then walking into spaces where all of a sudden I identify as Afro-Dominican, my husband is Korean, my kids are mixed, and I'm with my sister and my Black nephew, and everyone just like turns around and looks at our family. And my first immediate thought was like, why did you bring your family here, right? And people are walking around with MAGA t-shirts, and my kids are like, what, you know? So it was just, I've been thinking a lot about, I also am an educator, professor in higher ed who teaches about education and justice, and always talking about these topics around our privilege, oppression, trauma informed, and, you know, really noticing how whenever we talk about these topics, the autopilot function to stay surface level and not do the deep work that you were talking about. And after really 20 years of doing this work and having a practice, I think about, it was only when I started to have a practice that I started to ask myself, you know, well, what is this? Like, where is this coming from? My hypervigilance or my internalized oppression? Like, I get the theoretical stuff, but there's something that's so deeply embodied. And what do I need to do in order to address those things? And I can honestly say that until I really started to address and just like dig through the muck of that yucky internalized stuff and begin to let go, and it's going to take, you know, my entire lifetime, that really is like where the work is. And so I'm just so grateful that you're uplifting this wisdom, that you're sharing it. I feel like I'm not alone. I feel like I'm excited to and inspired and motivated to continue to do this work. And I'm just really grateful that you both have mentioned it. So thank you.
I'm just going to make a comment. Thank you so much, Monica, for sharing what you just shared. This work of facing, you know, whatever name we use for it, race issues, I believe it cannot be done without grief work going hand in hand with it. Because when I see how much trauma there has been, because, you know, like everywhere, I cannot just intellectually talk about it, right? So people of color need their people of color spaces to be ready to have this conversation, maybe before and after. People who are of European descent, need their own spaces maybe to work through what comes up when you talk about these spaces. And if you're not going to have those spaces, we might end up injuring each other more in this process. Happens many times. You start genuine conversations about race, any Sangha, even Sanghas, right? Forget corporations, forget nonprofits. Things just fall apart, even more, get more bitter, even instead of getting better. And so, yeah.
Kritee, on that subject, you mentioned grief circles, and you also mentioned Joanna Macy's work, and we actually started this year together with Joanna Macy. It was a wonderful evening, really powerful words from her. And there's so many resources out there around the work that reconnects and around grief circles, and I wonder if there's one you suggest if people wanted to do that work in a small community as you were saying you have. Is there a piece of that corpus that you think they should look at?
I am not, off the top of my head, can't think of resources necessarily right now. If I think of any, maybe we will post them on July 10th event. But the idea that I spoke about earlier was that, yes, let's do that collective grief work in groups of 30, 50, 100. And then find your little group of 5 to 8 people. I call them mini pods or pods. The zone of trust that we have, the number of relationships a human mind can hold at a given time, right? If you're in a room, how many people can you actually track with your eyes? How many can you track body language of? Is 5 to 8. And the idea is that you get together with people who you have medium amount of trust with and go deeper, go vulnerable. That's the basic instruction. There is literature now that I can think of. There are articles on importance of mini pods or teams that perhaps there is a way for me to send it to you later, which talks about how central that number is for you to do effective work. Like what happened in Georgia, what was to get the number of votes we were able to get. It wasn't, we uplift a few leaders, but they usually have a team, right? So.
Well, if there's something that comes to mind, it would be great resource for the January 10th day. And I think of other sociologists and innovators. Milton Wexler comes to mind, who did work on kind of what was the best group size for innovation. And he ended up, founding the Hereditary Disease Foundation and finding the first gene connected to a hereditary disease. And he actually attributed it to having the right size of people to go deep in that way. So it seems like every kind of work to have the kind of intimacy that allows for it. So yeah, I would love to know if there's any resources you suggest. And maybe we could take just one more question or comment. Virginia, I know you have had your hand up.
So thank you, Kritee and Rhonda. I was wanted to follow up about the grief pod or the circle. If I've been moving into some grieving issues, and last week we heard from Stephanie Kaza talking about that in terms of the environment and things, and I was wondering, with this, do people choose like a type of focus for the type of grieving that they're talking about, or just in general? I mean, I know I've done personal grieving in circles in the past, but you're talking about something rather specific, it sounds like. Is that right?
We have so many layers of trauma, and I think yes, we could have a general grief circle that brings up everything, but I think it is most powerful in my experience if it is focused. So and I highly encourage, to choose that group of people based on our identities, because it gets very complicated if people of color grieve with people of European descent. The frames of reference, the contexts are different, as it were. And then choose days. If you are going to keep working with this group of 7, 8 people for month after month, week after week, 1 month focus on climate, another month focus on class, gender. It's powerful when women grieve together. One of my most powerful teachers is a woman by the name Beth Garrigus, who just does circles for women, and it's about patriarchy, heteropatriarchy. The most powerful thing I have gone through myself as far as grief work is concerned. And so focus does help. It doesn't have to exclude other kinds of grief, because our body just knows grief. The biochemically body doesn't know this is racial trauma, this is class trauma, whatever. But some focus and facilitation can help early on until the group develops its own co-facilitation capabilities.
Yeah, if I could
Rhonda,
just...
please do add, I do have to slip off to lead my own Sangha's meditation in a couple of minutes, so handing it over.
I thank you so much, my dear, for all of your deep wisdom. I love this emphasis on this process, the small group suggestion and the micropods. And I'm just amplifying the value of that. I think, this book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, the idea was to have it be, give information and practices that you could take into small groups. But I love the specific idea of 5 to 8 people. And, it seems that staying with a particular topic, going into your affinity groups, your identity groups, and staying with that topic for a while has some benefit. The wounds are deep. And yes, we have wounds across all of our different identities and backgrounds, and we do need these supportive spaces. So, and at the same time, I just want to say, bringing that capacity to not just talk about it, but experience embodied practices for healing, for release, neurobiologically sound, body-based practices for letting go of the suffering once we've shared it out. In my next work, I want to add more about the embodied practices that have been shown, right, by neurobiologists, vagal theory specialists, et cetera, that we can actually bring into those grief circles so that we get out what we need, the stories that we need, but also practice in ways that help us feel, again, our resourcedness and connectedness to a thriving planet. So I think we really need to make sure that's a part of these circles as well.
That is so awesome. Just want to say one line, that grief circles are not to re-traumatize ourselves. I have seen grief work go very wrong when people just get into grief work, but they don't have the kind of practices Rhonda is referring to, where you keep breathing, where you move your neck and your eyes, and you don't take on more trauma from someone else talking about their trauma. You actually compost it by letting your whole being feel it. So you need to have solid grounding practices, right? Solid connection and trust to behold that unfolding of that trauma and grief.
Yes.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
We have to let you go, Kritee, and we're all kind of filled, I know, from tonight. And we're all going to meet again tomorrow night for Cinda Rushton's talk on more resilience. So we'll see each other tomorrow night. And Kritee and Rhonda, we'll see you on the 10th. Looking forward to it.
Thank you all so very much. Be well, be safe, be connected. Rejoice in your connection to this globe. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.